Were George Washington and the other founding presidents men of moral character? Or were they rebellious political zealots, as many historians now teach? How did such opposing views of American history emerge in academic circles today? And do they have any basis in factual history? Or are these new teachings the result of a revisionist agenda? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. In the classroom of our nation's history, Americans are increasingly taught opposing views of founding presidents, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Were our nation's founders truly men of moral and religious character? And what role, if any, did their religious faith play in the founding of the American government? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
U.S. presidents tend to be the focus of constitutional policy. Congress may pass a law, the Supreme Court may make a decision, but people see and notice what a president does. That tends to be the epitome of constitutionality. There is no one president that receives more scrutiny than George Washington. So he's often attacked, he's often mischaracterized, he's the subject of books both good and bad on all sides. I don't think any president has been written about more than George Washington. Now, that certainly was not an issue in early years. Early years, everybody agreed on Washington. He had thousands, tens of thousands of letters, handwritten documents. But in the last 40 to 50 years, there's been a real debate. Well, maybe he's not religious. Maybe he's not that moral. Maybe he was not committed to these principles. And so suddenly, a man that for 160 years had been really set in history has become the real subject of a lot of attacks. And it's not that they've discovered any more letters or documents or writings. It's become a political issue. Let me point out one other founder in this picture of the signing of the Constitution, and let me use that signer as the focal point for illustrating how revisionism works to create the myth that our founding fathers were not Christians. You see here George Washington. His accomplishments are well known. Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, President of the Convention which produced the Constitution, First President of the United States, and the President who oversaw the creation of the Bill of Rights. Having given 50 years of his life into such prominent leadership roles, it's no wonder that he was called the father of his country. You will find a statue of him in the rotunda, as well as find him pictured in several of the pictures in the rotunda. George Washington was also a prolific writer. In fact, there are nearly 100 volumes of his published writings, not including the countless volumes written about him by his friends and contemporaries. In 1855, John Frederick Schroeder went through Washington's available writings and collected Washington's pithy statements on a variety of topics. Schroeder compiled those statements into this book, The Maxims of George Washington, dividing Washington's maxims into 4 categories: his political maxims, social maxims, moral maxims, and religious maxims. In the original 1855 book, Schroeder introduced each category of maxims by including testimonials about Washington from several of his contemporaries. These testimonials came from noted individuals, including many of those honored here at the Capitol, such as Ben Franklin, General Marquis de Lafayette, John Paul Jones, John Hancock, Alexander Hamilton, and numerous others. Those who testified about Washington in the section on Washington's religious maxims included J.M. Sewall, a poet and songwriter friend of George Washington, who declared that George Washington was a firm believer in the Christian religion, and Chief Justice John Marshall, who served on Washington's staff during the Revolution and who declared he was a sincere believer in the Christian faith, and Elias Boudinot, who served as President of Congress during the Revolution and as a member of Congress under President Washington, who declared the general was a Christian, and J. Smith, a soldier in the Revolution and a U.S. congressman throughout Washington's presidency, who declared that Washington was not ashamed of his Christian profession, and the Reverend Devereux Jarrett, a Virginia minister who declared that Washington was a professor of Christianity. There are several additional testimonials scattered throughout the chapter, but there is no doubt that those who personally knew George Washington declared unequivocally that he was a Christian. This 1855 book, The Maxims of Washington, was recently reprinted in its entirety. At least it was almost reprinted in its entirety. What was changed was the introduction to each section. And in the section on Washington's religious maxims, instead of retaining the personal eyewitness testimonies from those who declared George Washington to be a Christian, instead a commentary was inserted from a current professor claiming that George Washington was a deist, not a Christian.
Was Washington written about as really who he was up until 1926?
Yes, 1926 is the first time. And the 1927 book that went back and rebutted the 1926 book noted that G and W had really stood, they were recognizable initials anywhere in the nation. When you had GW, you knew that was George Washington. And this author, W.E. Woodward, in 1926, had taken G and W, and according to these critics, that they made GW mean godless and wanton. I mean, that's the first time they attacked Washington or his character.
Wow.
Came up with it. That book has no footnotes in it. Attacked Washington all over. But this is a very secular guy. It's a guy who does not like the religious tone of America. And he wants to separate America from this leader who's so pro-religious, who really was very moral. I mean, there is not a charge against George Washington, any kind of immorality, until this knucklehead comes up with it in 1926.
Wow. I think what we're really debating here, Dave, is that ultimately history has somewhat been rewritten.
That's right. I mean, this is not something you make up and say, if only we had been this. We're saying, no, this is who we are. This is what happened. And history is being rewritten. That's why Washington over the last 40 years has become the subject of so many attacks. There are numerous books out now that say he is one of the deist founding fathers. He's one of the irreligious guys. He did not believe in religion. And you go, the most religious president we've had who set the religious tone. Matter of fact, this is one of the cool documents in American history. That is the first ever federal Thanksgiving proclamation we had in U.S. government, issued by George Washington, signed right down there at the bottom, George Washington. And I tell you, if you're a secular person, this is an embarrassingly religious document.
Wow.
There's nothing secular about this. There's no tone. You won't find deism in here, which they claim him to be. But to say that Washington's a deist, they say, well, he uses tones like omnipotent Father instead of using Jesus Christ. If you read Washington's writings, you'll find that George Washington has 54 biblical descriptions of God that he uses in writing. Now, I want to know somebody from the religious right today who has 54 biblical understandings into who God Almighty is. So they take a few of those phrases out, the great shepherd of our soul or whatever, and they say, oh, that's deistic, that's not religious. 54 different terms he uses out of the Bible to describe God. That is a man with a biblical understanding, with a great concept of who God is. But if you only want to take 4 or 5 or 6 of those titles, then you can say, oh, he's a deist. He also uses Jesus Christ. He also uses Christian. He also uses Savior. He also uses Redeemer. These are all terms that he uses, but we won't talk about those. We're going to say he's a deist, and therefore, since he's a deist, he wouldn't want religious activities in public affairs. So that's what the debate's over. That's why people fight over history, because it affects public policy.
In the classroom of our nation's history, Americans are increasingly taught opposing views of founding presidents, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Were our nation's founders truly men of moral and religious character? And what role, if any, did their religious faith play in the founding of the American government? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
What you try to do when you want to separate a following from a leader is you attack the leader.
Yeah.
And you don't go after specifically what he says, you create tones about him. Same happens with George Washington. They say, oh, he's a deist. Well, religious people say, then I don't care what he said, you know. And that's a problem.
One of the other slanders is that he was a slave owner and all of that, and so that raises concern in a lot of people groups that he was a slave owner.
Yeah.
Truth be told, he was trying to abolish slavery.
You'll find that he was one of the leaders in ending slavery. Now, it's really hard for Americans to understand today. He lived in a state that would not allow him to emancipate his slaves. Now, he did when he died. But you have state laws in place that said you cannot free slaves. We actually have records of those who were freed by owners who, after the owner died, were put right back into slavery. This is the natural condition of blacks. You have to have slavery. You cannot free them. That is illegal. He lived in a state that believed that. He did not believe that. You'll find that he signed the first federal anti-slavery law. This is also hard for us to understand. He owned really a couple hundred slaves. Most of them were given to him when he was between 12 and 14 years old. So he was given all these slaves. He went broke trying to make sure that they had adequate provision, that he took care of them, that he fed them. He would not sell them. He would not break families up. That was a huge economic burden to him, but he absolutely took care of his slaves as if they were family.